recording, and we'll move back on to the lecture. So just get this to, there we go. Okay, so let's just start with where we left off on Wednesday or Monday. I don't know what day it is, Monday. So let's just start with where we left off. We were talking about the effects of climate change. We have here a map of changes in consecutive dry days across the US, and I mentioned this briefly on Wednesday, but what you have here are two different simulations, one on the left for rapid emission reductions, and the other on the right where we continue emitting greenhouse gases at the same level that we've been doing. And what you see is that the simulations predict a significant increase in the number of consecutive dry days, up to about 40% increase, especially in the Southwest. You can actually see that Mexico fares even worse than most of the Southwestern US. And that will if that occurs, that will significantly impact agricultural operations in all of these locations. Now, in some cases you'll hear that climate change is good, it will increase crop production, increase CO2, etc. What you have here are again simulations for various different crop yields. The assumption here is that despite the climate change, there's still adequate soil moisture and nutrients. So the temperature increases, but soil moisture and nutrient levels are unchanged. So the effect is really the temperature change. And we have two different scenarios. What you see with the kind of gold-colored line is B1 with a lower emission scenario, and the red line is a higher emission scenario. So what you see is that there are significant differences in both of these scenarios, but also significant differences in crop yield. So for instance, if you look at alfalfa, sunflower, you don't really, safflower, you don't see significant changes. Tomato, don't see significant changes with the lower emission scenario. But then with the higher emissions scenario, you see significant decreases in crop yield for tomatoes, for rice, for wheat, and very significant increases or decreases in crop yield for cotton and sunflower. So the effect of climate change on crops is not consistent across the different crop species. Another thing we look at is the effect on ecosystem. This is just a schematic diagram looking at climate change, the effect of climate change on algae blooms. Back in about 2015, Toledo had to shut down its drinking water supply for 3 days because of the impact of algae blooms on water quality. Release of cyanotoxins, which they did not have the capability to remove. So until they could bring that online, they had to shut down water for the entire city. What happens with climate change is you've got warmer waters, those enhance the algae blooms, you've got thicker blooms, those algae blooms can release cyanotoxins, which are potent neurotoxins. The dark algae absorbs heat, and then you've got this cyclic response. And then the other thing, and this is the last that I'll show you in terms of the effects, but there's multitude of other effects where there are changes in, for instance, in species habitat location. So this is a change in latitude of bird center of abundance. So what do you see? You see that as weather change or the global temperatures increase, you're seeing birds migrate further north, or they're residing further north because of those warmer temperatures. And this causes other problems. For instance, you see dengue fever cropping up in locations where dengue fever didn't occur before. You see malaria at higher altitudes than we saw before, or at in areas further from the equator. And that's because the climate is changing. As the climate changes, the mosquito is able to survive at higher altitudes because of the warmer temperatures, or at higher elevation, and also at locations further from the equator, so from those tropical environments. So what are we doing? Back in 1988, the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environmental Program convened an intergovernmental panel on climate change. So this was the first time, 1988. The goal was to assess scientific information, to assess the impact on both socioeconomic conditions, on environmental conditions, and to formulate strategies. This led to a number of additional meetings, including the Kyoto Protocol. And at that point, 1997, a decision was made that required the wealthiest nations to reduce climate change emissions and assist the developing countries to also move to reducing emissions. And this continued throughout. There was the Copenhagen Accord, Cancun Agreement, led finally to the Paris Agreement in 2016. And where we are now is the US has pulled out of the Paris Agreement. Interestingly enough, while we're seeing some very significant changes on the federal level in terms of climate change, we're seeing companies in many cases still look to reduce greenhouse emissions, look at what they can do to enhance sustainability, and we're seeing local governments, regional governments try and address climate change emission, greenhouse gases on their level. Why are we here? One of the reasons is that the politics of greenhouse gases are very much tied to the politics of fossil fuel consumption, the economics related to fossil fuel consumption. There's also significant issues with lobbyists, misinformation. One of the challenges has to do with the misinformation about climate change. It's much the same that was done with leaded gasoline. That lead was not harmful. There was a significant misinformation campaign back in the 1920s regarding lead. There's significant misinformation regarding tobacco, and there is a significant misinformation regarding greenhouse gases. The other is accusations of environmental colonialism, imperialism, activism. I'm not going to play the video. You can watch it on your own. It's called Taming or the Green Dragon. Basically refers to any environmental policies as the green dragon, and that we have to stop this green dragon in its tracks. And then there's also the lack of faith in scientific process and computer models, and I think this really also centers around issues of terms of climate change. Now, back in the about 2008, 2009, there was a push for Congress to implement regulations that are acts that would allow regulations related to greenhouse gases. That never happened. It was clear it wasn't going to happen. And then back in December of 2009, EPA issued basically a decree that greenhouse gases are a pollutant and they threaten public health and the environment. That allowed EPA to start to regulate greenhouse gases. So that rule had to have been made, that decision had to be made, and that allowed EPA then to start developing regulations around the emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases. The initial regulations that were proposed were essentially a cap and trade. This was the same type of strategies that had been used with NOx and SO2. Significantly reduced these levels, and it was thought that it would have a significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions. There were also more stringent emission standards placed on light-duty vehicles, not placed on heavy-duty vehicles and trucks, but they were placed on light-duty vehicles. And also standards placed on mileage, miles per gallon. Same time, various agencies, EPA, NOAA, USGS, gathered together and created what was referred to as a climate change adaptation plan, recognizing that climate change is occurring, sea level is rising, and then how do we adapt to these new conditions. In terms of energy engineering solutions, significant effort has been made to produce appliances that are more energy efficient. This whole EPA STAR program. There's tremendous switch from coal to natural gas. We've talked about that, and that the heat content of natural gas is significantly greater than that of coal. So per mass burned, we're producing less CO2. The real question with natural gas is going to be with methane and methane emissions in extraction of natural gas. There has been a significant move towards renewable energy, even on campus. We have significant now solar arrays, number of solar arrays, and MSU is planning to continue to build more solar array farms to reduce the reliance on natural gas. More efficient transportation systems. If we can produce efficient transportation systems that release less greenhouse gases, then that's a significant benefit. And then lastly, there's really this issue of carbon sequestration. How do we capture the carbon that's being emitted? Is there a way we can use that carbon in some sense, versus just trying to discharge it into deep wells? So most of these are in terms of what can we do. A lot of this is on a smaller level, some greater. To move to plant trees, expand open space. The question is what impact does that have when there's such a significant reduction in the amount of land, rainforest, for instance, in the Amazon? Mentioned what we're doing in terms of solar power, significant efforts in terms of sustainable farming and forestry, again, to try and mitigate some of the effects of climate change. And then looking at more efficient energy policies, moving away from fossil fuels and developing technologies that are renewable. So I'm going to stop this is just some things you can think about doing on a personal level. And then I'll just take any questions before we move on to air pollution regulations. So I think most of you are muted, maybe you all. So if you've got questions, feel free to just type them into the chat. You can type them in privately or to the entire group that's online. And in the meantime, what I will do is bring up the other set of slides. So if you have any questions, and those can be questions related to the rest of the semester, I don't know that I can answer it, but I will try. Just in general, it can also be questions related to climate change. So I'm going to stop this, and then I'll bring up the other set of slides. And you should, is it possible for us to do some, the question is, in terms of note writing, right now, I'm just doing lectures because most of what I'm doing now is just lecturing, but the slides are all recorded, so you can go back and take more notes if you really want. And the other thing, once we get through regulations, we're going to be moving on to much more quantitative material. I'm going to move at that point to the tablet. I haven't used the tablet for lecturing yet. And then at that point, I will be doing note writing. So, and I'll be actually note writing on the slides, so you'll have that. So hopefully that will help in terms of this material. Like I said, in the meantime, I am recording lectures, so you will have the recorded lectures. Hopefully that helps. Any other questions? Okay. So let's just move to, let's just move to air pollution regulations. And I just added this at the beginning, just as a reminder, logistics posted, there's a logistic PDF. It's the second document on LON-CAPA now. So please take a look at that. I've also posted team assignments in the semester project folder. Okay, and one more thing while we're doing this. The Wednesday air quality FE review session is postponed. I actually put this in this morning before classes were canceled, or not canceled, but put online. So I'm trying to contact Mr. Engel to find out if he will do Thursday's FE section online, or he will just postpone it. As soon as I know, I will let you know. But I'm working on that. Okay. So let's look at acts and regulations. Okay, so let's just start with acts. Okay, so an act is a law passed by Congress that and in this case, it gives the agency the authority to develop regulations. Okay, so when the Clean Air Act was passed by Congress, it didn't develop detailed regulations, but it gave the US EPA the authority to develop those regulations. Now, the regulations are the enforceable rules. So that's what you must do, okay, or must not do. Congress also has to authorize a regulatory agency. So if we talked about OSHA regulations, Congress had to give OSHA the authority to write regulations to protect occupational health and safety. Congress had to give EPA the authority to write regulations to protect water, air, soil. Transportation. Congress had to give Department of Federal Highway Authority the ability to write, the authority to write those regulations. So the agencies are given the authority by Congress. And then the codes are, these regulations become codified. So basically, for instance, if a new regulation is being proposed by EPA, they have to publish that regulation for public comment, typically for 90 days. They then have to take those public comments, they have to read those, they have to process them in some form, and then they write the final regulation that becomes codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. And you can find, if you search Code of Federal Regulations, you can find these online, and they range from everything from transportation to nuclear, to radiation, to environmental regulations, etc. Okay. Now, in 1955, there was no EPA. There was only the U.S. Public Health Service, and the first act related to air pollution was actually passed in 1955. Now, kind of think back at what's happening at that time. Okay, we had Denora, Pennsylvania. We had major episodes in London. We saw major episodes in New York City. We had significant increasing smog and air pollution throughout much of the US. So the Air Pollution Control Act, what it did was it dispersed $3 million. It's not a lot of money, but it's a little more at that time, to research, train, and provide technical assistance. That's all it did. Okay. At that point, there were no regulations. In 1955, they expanded the funding to $5 million. So Congress expanded that. And then in 1963, the Clean Air Act was passed. So that was the first Clean Air Act. Now, what that did was, again, we have the Public Health Service. So it gave the Public Health Service the authority over enforcement. The question was, enforcement of what? It directed the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, so that was one department at the time, to prepare criteria about the effects of air pollution on human health. Still no regulations. It required semi-annual reports to Congress. Still no regulations. It established a technical committee, and it authorized $65 million. Still no regulations. In 1965, Congress passes the Motor Vehicle Control Act, this first set of regulations that are developed, and these set emission standards for 1965 model vehicles. That was the extent at that point in time of the regulations. It also did start looking at provisions for controlling air pollution between Mexico, the US, and Canada. So it started recognizing the significant multi-regional impacts of climate change, of air pollution. And then it called for research on SO2 from motor vehicle emissions. 1967, Congress passes the Air Quality Act. This was the first time that it gave, in this case, the Public Health Service, because there's still no EPA, the ability to publish air quality criteria. It also gave them the ability to recommend control technology. So we're moving towards regulations, but those regulations were on a state level. Okay. So what it did was it authorized the states to develop and adopt standards. So there was no standards at a federal level. The standards would be at a state level. If you think about how we talked about about transport of pollutants, it's extremely difficult to control pollutants on a statewide level, but that was what was done. Now, 1970, Nixon created the US EPA. And the first act that was passed was the Clean Air Act Amendment. So this is a period of time. These are actually real images. These are the protesters on the image on the left are protesters in Cleveland, Ohio, protesting the city's air pollution. The picture on the right is actually from EPA archives and showing just all of this emissions from an industrial source. So what the Clean Air Act Amendments of 1970 did was it gave EPA the authority to start controlling air pollutants and establish a set of regulations. So it's really in 1970 with the Clean Air Act Amendment that we moved from a state level based regulations to federal regulations, and that's important. What the Clean Air Act Amendments 1970 did was they set what are referred to as National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS. It set standards based on health. So these are health-based standards. Those are primary. Now we talked about primary pollutants, secondary pollutants. Entirely different language. Okay. Now we're talking about primary standards and secondary standards. So these are both enforceable, but they're different levels. So unlike those of you that took 483, know that there with water we have primary standards and secondary standards, but secondary standards aren't enforceable. With air, both are enforceable. So it's an important difference, and it's different. It's not the same as primary pollutants and secondary pollutants. If somebody has the mic on, if you can mute your mic, that'll be awesome. Thanks. Otherwise, you're going to, I think, be caught in the recording too. So the Clean Air Act Amendments established 5 criteria pollutants: carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, what was referred to as total suspended particulates, and photochemical oxidants. In 1990, the last set of Clean Air Act amendments was promulgated by Congress, and this changed these regulations. Carbon monoxide, NO2, sulfur dioxide were still there. The TSP, total suspended particulates, became particulate matter. Initially, the focus was on PM10, those larger materials, and later on PM2.5. Photochemical oxidants became ozone. It's hard to measure the aggregate oxidants, so we can much more effectively measure ozone and therefore more effectively regulate ozone. And then in 1978, lead was added in 1978. It was amended in 1991. And lead, all of these are still the NACs that we're using now. They're still regulated, and they're still measured on a routine basis. Now, when we look at criteria, these criteria pollutants, we use that information to determine whether or not an area is attainment or non-attainment. And if an area is attainment, if that area meets or exceeds, or does better really, than the primary standard. So if that area meets that, it's attainment. Now, if you were to build a new facility in that attainment area, you would be required to use what is referred to as the best available control technology. Or if you were going to make major modifications in an existing process, you would be required to use the best available technology. EPA has determined what are best available control technologies for various different sources. What's used is both the efficiency of that process, but also cost benefit. So with all of this, there is a cost benefit analysis that was done in order to determine whether or not a technology is adopted as a fact. These are more restrictive than what is referred to as reasonably available control technology, but they're less stringent, so they're less efficient than what is referred to as the lowest achievable control technology. So how does an industry decide on this? What they're looking at is the industry is the one that makes the first level decisions. So you're going to build this new facility. The industry or the company that's proposing this would look at total source emissions. So back to AP42, if that's the only data we have. It could be based on experience if they have another similar facility. They're going to look at the regional environmental impact. So how is this going to change the air quality in that particular region? They will evaluate several control technologies, at this point on paper. They're going to look at what would be the proposed reduction in emissions, how much energy is consumed, how much will this process cost. They will then rank the technologies. They'll evaluate the most effective controls. They document all of these decisions, and they will select a best available control technology. That information then gets submitted to the regulatory agency. So in Michigan, it would get submitted to EGLE. Someone at EGLE has typically 90 days to review that document. That document could be hundreds of pages long. They then review that document, typically come back with questions about that document, and then through that process, a decision is made. And we'll talk about permitting, but then a permit would be issued to construct, not to operate, just to construct. Later on, it's more that has to be done to get a permit to operate. And I've kind of gone through some of these notes previously, and just to kind of give you an example, for instance, for dry bulk fertilizer handling, the best available technology is baghouse, or what is referred to as choke feeding. It's a way you're actually handling the material. Mechanical transfers have to be done in a enclosed conveyor, and mixing has to be done within an enclosure. So that's essentially what are determined by EPA as best available technology. Non-attainment areas are those areas that don't meet the primary standard. So in this case, it's just looking at the primary standard. What I've given you here are the total estimated, this is based on 2010 population, but the total estimated population living in non-attainment areas in the US. This is actually in thousands. So you see actually the greatest number for 8-hour ozone. So that's a standard that was promulgated in 2015. And that's the one that has actually been the most difficult to attain, to meet. And we've talked about why. Okay, it's not a straightforward, it's a secondary pollutant. We have to be able to control VOCs, we have to be able to control NOx, and as we mentioned with climate change, as climate warms, we produce more ozone given the same level emissions of VOCs and NOx. So it just becomes even more and more difficult to attain that standard. Non-attainment areas are required to either use the lowest achievable emission rates, okay, and for new or modified sources, or a reasonable available control technology for existing sources. But the analysis is essentially the same. You still have to be able to show that you're not going to essentially harm the environment or harm human health. This gives you an idea of the locations in the US where that are non-attainment for 8-hour ozone, and you can see that it varies significantly. Michigan, for the most part, is marginal. You go out to the west coast, to parts of California, and you see that it's extreme. They've also, as we discussed, will have longer time period to actually become attainment. These are the counties designated as non-attainment for one or more. So you can see that there are significant, actually on the East Coast, you have much of the Northeast that is non-attainment, in this case for 2 NACs. You go out to parts of California and they're actually non-attainment for 6 NACs. So there's significant issues there that that need to be addressed in order to bring that area into attainment. Now, what the Clean Air Act amendments required were state implementation plans. So every state has to have these plans. They're formulated by the state. They're filed with the EPA. So this is essentially a contract between a state and EPA on how the state will ensure attainment or maintain attainment. Again, like as I mentioned before, when a new regulation is passed and public comment period required, the states have to involve the public in that approval process for a state implementation plan. And if the state implementation plan isn't acceptable, and EPA and the state have gone back and forth and they can't agree on an acceptable plan, then the US EPA can actually come in and assume responsibility. And then they take over all of the enforcement process. Doesn't happen very often. It has been threatened numerous times. For instance, US EPA has threatened Texas a number of times that they would take over their air process, part of, in order to enforce the Clean Air Act. Prevention of significant deterioration is a regulatory term. If an area is attainment and an industry is seeking to construct a new operation, they're required to go through a formal procedure referred to as prevention of significant deterioration. It's the responsibility of the industry to show that whatever they're proposing to do isn't going to harm the environment. And it's this permit that allows them initially to construct and then later to operate. So there's two different permits. It's a construction permit and an operating permit. But what you're required to do for an attainment area is to show that there's a prevention of significant deterioration. It's a little bit different for non-attainment. Okay, for non-attainment, it's referred to as a non-attainment new source review. And that, again, it's a similar process. The difference is you have to use lowest achievable emission rate. So there's a little bit difference in terms of what the requirements are, and the name is different, but the process is similar in terms of what the goals and requirements. The air areas are divided into three classes. So for instance, national parks, wilderness areas, pristine areas are class 1. Class 2 are attainment areas and non-classified areas. Their industrial development is allowed, but again, the industry has to show that changes in air quality are within the prescribed levels, that you're not going to, again, significantly deteriorate that air quality. And then class 3 are selected areas that can be designated for development. Again, okay, so essentially there you're allowing some potential decrease in air quality, but you can't exceed the NAAQS. So it's an area set aside for development, but again, you can't propose something, okay, you wouldn't be given a permit to construct if that industry resulted in the NAAQS being exceeded. This was done to try and protect certain areas. It's actually more difficult to get a permit, for instance, in a class 1 area than it would be in a class 2 or a class 3. EPA also set what are referred to as new source performance standards. So again, this is a, if you're proposing a new process or a significant modifications, then again, you go through a review. And EPA has set these standards that must be followed in order to construct and operate. So these are developed, they're implemented by EPA. You have to use the best demonstrated technology. So there are sets of these best demonstrated technologies for each potential source. And then again, enforcement is delegated to the state, although EPA can come in and enforce these if the states aren't doing so. And the whole process is referred to as a new source review. And this is required for any new stationary sources. So for instance, if MSU were going to build an entirely new power plant, they would have to go through a new source review. Or if they were making major modifications to the existing facility, they would go through a new source review. And this is required irrespective of whether an area is attainment or non-attainment. I'm going to stop there. We'll pick up on Friday looking at what are referred to as NESHAPS. I have one question about the poster presentation. At this point, if the university is still closed and what I most likely will do is have you submit the posters, and you won't actually do a presentation, but you'll just be assessed based on the poster, the visual aspects of your poster, the information that's presented on the poster, and the proposal, but not the actual presentation of the poster. Let's just hope we don't come to that. But that's where, so the question, will it be virtual or actual poster? If the university is still, it's not closed, if we're still on modified operations, or if we're still online, you will submit your poster as a PDF. You will not have to print the poster. If we're back in session and we're meeting in person, then then you'll print the poster. And it's much harder to get a permit under Class 1 environments, almost impossible. The idea was that you protect those Class 1 environments. And that's one of the big debates right now with mining, et cetera, because most of a lot of that would be done in a Class 1 environment. So if you're actually mining in a national park or a national preserve, then that would be a Class 1 environment. And in the past, it was very, very difficult to get permits to accomplish that. Other questions? No other questions? Okay, what I will do then is I will stop recording. I will post, the slides are already posted. I will post the recording on Non-Kappa. And then at 3, I'll switch to the personal meeting room. So it's a change in the link, but and then if you have other questions or want to meet for office hours, then we can meet for office hours. I have homework due on Monday. I think what I'm going to do is extend the due date till Wednesday because I can imagine for a lot of you, this whole change is significant. Many of you will be moving back home. So in order to try and take off at least some of the stress, let's just move all of the due dates till Wednesday for the next homework assignments. Okay, and that hopefully will help get through the next week or so. Any other questions? Okay, I am going